Hello, my name's Nick Park. This is Evangelical Alliance Ireland's weekly video. It's Friday, but Sunday's coming. We're going to do two things today. First of all, I'm going to give you a quick update upon a letter that we've received from the Taoiseach, the Prime Minister, about the reopening of churches. And after that, we're going to just talk a little bit about schools, school curriculums in particular, and some of the books that are being used that parents have concerns about. But first of all, our letter from the Taoiseach, and I'm not going to read it in full, but I want to just zero in on a couple of things that was in this letter that we received at Evangelical Alliance Ireland from the Taoiseach over the last couple of days. He says, "We clearly recognise the value of and the right to public worship. Emergency legislation has, from the outset of the crisis, impinged on a wide range of personal liberties, but has done so for the common good. Then I fully acknowledge the concerns of faith leaders and share your wish for a safe return to public worship. It was for this reason that government has already indicated that we would review the recommencement of public worship along with a number of other sectors from 4th of May. The extent of that recommencement will be informed by public health advice. I can assure you that the government, when it meets next week, will give careful and positive consideration to reopening places of worship in May." Then he says, "I recognise the importance of faith and of communal worship in people's lives." He does also mention the fact that churches were so zealous and stringent, really, in applying safety measures when we were able to open during the summer and also then again over Christmas. And that such measures will need to continue when we reopen. And then he says, "As we look forward to the gradual reopening of society, when the prevailing public health conditions allow, I wish you and your communities a safe return to worship." So what's this letter actually saying? Well, basically it's saying this, that the government is not anti-Christian. They've not got an agenda against the church and against churches meeting. They are treating us either the same as everybody else or actually prioritising somewhat our re-establishment of meeting and worship before some other public gatherings. The government have not made a promise that we will open in the first week of May. That, I've seen on social media saying, well, if they do what they've promised, the government has not promised that at any stage. In fact, all of us involved in leadership during this COVID pandemic can truly say that we can't make any promises about what happens going forward because things can change so quickly. In fact, the government's decision on this is going to be based on the science. It's going to be based on the numbers. It's going to be based on the R number, the number of cases, the number of deaths, the 14-day incidence rate, etc. Now, what that means is this. No amount of petitions that we send in or letters that we write are actually going to change this. It's the science that is going to determine it. And thank God the science is moving in the right direction. And thank God that we are seeing things improving, and we need to keep praying that that continues. But what this letter is saying is that the government has a positive desire to see us opening for worship, that they are aiming for the beginning of May. They can't promise it, but that is what they're aiming for. And I would simply say this, as a church pastor, I am making sure that our church in Drogheda is fully prepared to meet for worship again on Sunday, the 9th of May. We wait to see if the science will back up that happening and whether that will actually happen. But we're going to be ready. We're getting prepared for the 9th of May, and I would involve other church leaders to do likewise. Now, having talked about that, there's another thing we want to touch on in this week's video. And that is what we do as Christians when we are confronted in media with content which is of a sexual nature, or when we encounter obscene language or extreme violence in media. How do we react to that? Now, we don't want to go back to where we were in 1966 when there was a famous controversy about the bishop and the nightie, where a couple were participating in a quiz on the Late Late Show, and one of the questions was what color of nightie the wife wore on their wedding night. And they answered that she couldn't remember. She said, maybe I didn't wear one. And there was a whole hullabaloo was kicked up with a bishop intervening and demanding that heads would roll and everything else. I guess where we are today, that sounds very tame indeed. We don't want to go back to the times whenever Christians were simply seen as the slightest mention of sex was the one thing guaranteed to have us firing off letters of complaint. But we all need to draw a line somewhere. You know, I'm sure we've all been in that situation where we're watching something, enjoying a movie, a TV show or something in our homes, and then there's just something comes up, some content in it, and we just say, you know what, I am not comfortable having this on in my house. As a follower of Jesus, I don't want to be looking at that, and we have to turn it off. We've probably all had things that we felt we wanted to complain about, and some of us have complained about things. Most notably, a lot of us complained about a so-called comedy sketch on New Year's Eve that was blasphemous and portrayed God as a rapist, and quite rightly, we took issue with that and raised that with the television station, and they apologized and said they would take steps to make sure such a thing would never happen again. Now, we cannot be totally ignorant of what's going on out in wider culture. If we are not educated enough to know what's happening in the culture in the world, then we can end up making awful fools of ourselves. And that did happen, actually, within the last year, whenever there was a campaign launched against the new Minister for Children, Roderick O'Gorman, and there was one part of that campaign there was a internet meme that referred to a very famous classical painting, and people who didn't understand that began claiming that the minister was promoting cannibalism and all kinds of nonsense. Now this was not primarily a Christian campaign, it was actually a right-wing campaign, but some Christians got on board with it and made us look awfully foolish and ignorant and ill-educated, to be honest, that we didn't understand what that was about. Now, we can't be totally ignorant of wider culture, but neither can we conform to popular culture. The Bible tells us that we should not be conformed to the pattern of this world. In fact, we should have our own culture, a Jesus culture. But even in working out how we live out that Jesus culture, like you look at the Apostle Paul was well aware of the classical culture and the Roman culture and the Jewish culture in which he lived and ministered. Now, even when we are looking at the Bible, there are some passages that we might even feel uncomfortable with and sharing in a normal setting. You know, in our own church in Drogheda, I've been teaching through Genesis, through the patriarchs, and we got to Genesis chapter 34, the passage about the rape of Dinah and the deception involved with circumcision that Simeon and Levi used to slaughter the Shechemites. It was horrible, and I felt quite uncomfortable. Even though it's the Word of God, I was aware that there were some settings I would have to be very careful how I presented that, because the Bible deals with some pretty nitty-gritty stuff at time. So where we draw the line at what we watch or don't watch is we're probably all going to draw that line in slightly different places. But one fundamental principle is that parents are the gatekeepers for our children. That as parents, we should be the ones who decide what content is appropriate or not appropriate for our children to be looking at or reading. And that's where there's a huge area of concern. And I want to highlight the work done by Wendy Drynan. Wendy is a teacher based in the west of the country. And Wendy has been doing research into some of the books that children in schools in Ireland are studying as part of their curriculum. Now, we really need to make ourselves aware of this, because I don't know if you knew this, but our children in schools are studying books that deal with paedophilia, that as part of entertainment or so-called literature, paedophilia, rape, bestiality, and various other kinds of perversion. And you know what? Now, I understand that there is great literature that sometimes will not conform to a Christian's standard of morality. Actually, with some of these books, their literary value is very questionable indeed. And the content is certainly inappropriate. That the fact that adults will be sharing and encouraging children to read this kind of material, for me, raises actually very serious child protection issues, among others. Now, we need to make ourselves aware, and I would encourage you to go to a website that Wendy has set up. It's called irishparents.blogspot.com. So irishparents.blogspot.com. And if you go to that website, you will see a list of some of the books on the curriculum where there are the biggest concerns. You may not agree with the assessment there of every single book. That's not the issue. The issue is whether you believe, and particularly those of you who are parents, believe that this is appropriate for the state to be deciding that your children will be exposed to much of this material. So we need to make ourselves aware. Please feel free to write to the Minister of Education, Norma Foley, if you have concerns about this. And if you don't get a satisfactory answer and action from the minister, then certainly address your own local TDs and get them to raise the issue as well. As I said, nobody's looking for us to go back to the bishop and the knighty days of 1966. But what we do need to do is to actually go back to a place where parents can choose what is appropriate for their children to view or read, and to ensure that their children are not exposed to grossly indecent, perverted, and inappropriate material. So I thoroughly encourage you to visit again that website, irishparents.blogspot.com. Do you know, at times it's a dark world that we are ministering in. Some people's ideas of what is right and wrong seem to be totally upside down at times. But I want you to hold on in faith. Why? Because it might be Friday, but Sunday's coming. God bless you, and please join us again next Friday for our weekly video from Evangelical Alliance Ireland.